At 3 a.m., he was jolted awake by voices coming from the living room. But what happened next still keeps Dan up at night and gives him nightmares. I need to tell you guys a story about what happened to my friend Dan last winter. You're probably going to want to get rid of your smart devices after hearing this. And he's not the type of guy that would make this stuff up. He's a diesel mechanic, so he works with his hands and actually hates most modern technology. And I guess that's what makes this whole thing even more disturbing. Dan lives alone in a small house outside the city, and he spends most of his free time working extra hours to try to pay off his student loans. And he's not the type of guy that jumps on tech trends, and we all give him a lot of shit for it. But this last Christmas, he decided to buy himself an Alexa. Most of our friends have smart home devices, so Dan was familiar with it, and he thought it would be nice to have one around. Something that would help him remember birthdays, to let him know what the weather is, and to be honest, he thought it might be nice to have another voice in the house to talk to. Maybe hopefully make it feel less lonely. Dan tried to put it together following the instructions, but he could never get the damn thing to work right. And he said he would just feel really stupid standing in his living room shouting, "Hey Alexa," into the void of his empty living room with no response. So eventually he just gave up altogether and forgot about it. And that's when things started to get really weird. It was one really super cold night in January, and Dan was sitting alone in his living room at night watching the Weather Channel. There was a massive blizzard heading straight for us that night, and he wanted to make sure he was prepared for what was to come. But that's when he heard it, that distinctive boot up sound of an Alexa. And then all of a sudden its blue light just popped to life up in the corner of the room. And then it says, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question." Totally unprompted. And Dan just froze because he hadn't said anything. He never said a word. And he was really startled at first, which I think any of us would be. But then he kind of started to think to himself, it was probably something the weatherman said. The Alexa was probably picking something up from the TV, and it was just responding to that. So he just kind of shrugged it off. But it still really creeped him out, and he was left with this feeling of it just was wrong. And that night, the blizzard did hit, and the entire neighborhood lost power. And the snow was piling up so high, it looked like Mount Everest was forming in your front yard. Nobody was leaving their homes. And there was nothing you could do but ride out the storm, so Dan just bundled up and then crawled into bed to try to stay warm and get some sleep. But at 3 a.m., he was jolted awake by voices coming from the living room, and like multiple voices, like there were several people just chilling in his living room having a quiet conversation. And as he gets out of bed and starts creeping down the hallway to try to check it out, he can hear the voices. They're almost like a whisper, and they start getting louder the closer he gets to the living room. And he can't understand what they're saying, but he knows it sounds like his Alexa is having a conversation with somebody. But that was impossible. There was no power. Nothing should have been working. And the moment he stepped into the living room, everything went silent. And Dan was so confused, he didn't even realize what he was doing, but he said out loud, "What the fuck?" Not even realizing it. But then Alexa responds, "I found somebody who wants to talk to you." And in this voice that was almost quite Alexa, but not Alexa. But what happened next still keeps Dan up at night and gives him nightmares. Dozens of overlapping whispers just explode from the Alexa, and all of them whispering but in different volumes and pitches, and Dan couldn't tell what they were saying, but he was pretty sure he was hearing his name in there. And the voices weren't mechanical or digital. They sounded human, like desperate, like they'd been waiting for this moment to talk. And even though he knew the power was out, Dan was freaking out, so he just ran over and ripped Alexa's power cord out of the wall. And all the voices stopped, and the blue light just faded away. And Dan just stood there in the darkness and the silence, trying to make some sense, some rational thought of how or what just happened. But as soon as Dan's heart slowed down enough that it didn't feel like it was gonna beat out of his chest, over across the room on the coffee table, a little light just flickered on. It was his phone, and he was getting some kind of an alert. But after he bent down and picked up his phone, all sense of reason and logic just left Dan's body. Messages in his notes app just started appearing, typing themselves out randomly in front of him. And it was stuff like, "Hi Dan, how can I help you? We're all here now. Thank you for helping us." But message after message after message started appearing. And at first they all seemed like they were aimed at Dan. But then all of a sudden they turned into what seemed like some conversation back and forth between two people. And he just watched in horror as his phone is documenting a conversation that he's not a part of. Dan didn't know what else to do, so he just grabbed his Alexa and threw it out the back door into the snow. And then he powered down his cell phone and he just sat there in the cold, dark living room in shock. Like, did this really just happen? And after Dan got rid of the Alexa, he never experienced anything like that again. And when he first told us the story, we were like, "Yeah, Danny boy, that's not how electronics work. It was probably just operator error, or you just set it up wrong, or maybe it was even a dream." We never really thought that he was trying to pull some kind of prank on us. He wasn't that type of guy, and he was not really good at that stuff. But I don't know, man. He was so convinced about what happened that night, he got rid of any smart device he had, including his cell phone. And maybe it was just his imagination. Or maybe the whole thing was just a nightmare that was brought on by the stress of working all those extra hours and then being isolated alone in a storm. I don't know, but if you're anything like me, the next time you activate your smart device, you might want to ask yourself, who exactly is it that you're talking to?